Hey everyone, I'm going to take a look today at Race, a Theological Account by J Kameron Carter. And I'm just going to totally tip my hand at the beginning of this review and say that this is an absolutely astounding book of philosophy and theology and some history, although it's mostly a work of philosophy and theology. It's just amazing. So I'm just going to say that right up front. Maybe you can just stop watching the review now. But I do want to dive into a little bit of it because I also don't think this book is necessarily for everyone. So I want to explain a little bit why, even though I just absolutely think it's a stunning work. So Carter's main idea, which is admittedly extremely difficult to capture in a sentence because this is a very, very wide-ranging, very comprehensive book in a lot of ways. His main idea is basically that race, as we understand, as humans have kind of come to understand ourselves as raced people, as people that can be categorized in races, that's an issue tied to modernity, tied to the Enlightenment modernity kind of era. And that is also, and this is what he's specifically bringing to that, because a lot of people are talking about race as kind of a product of the Enlightenment. That's not necessarily a new thing he's saying, but what he's saying here that's specific to him is that whole understanding, that whole way of imagining ourselves is also a theological imagination. It has, we draw that imagination with theological ideas, namely, what do we think about God and ourselves as being created by God, and that's what he's bringing to it. Us considering ourselves as raced people is a theological thing, and therefore needs a theological response or a theological account if we want to account for that understanding and undo that understanding, especially the harmful effects of it. So that's a really, really short summary. One really important thing, and I'll say maybe more about this at the end of the review, he draws out an idea of supersessionism, which is a theological concept that relates to how Christians or theologians understand Christianity as replacing Judaism. It's a problematic idea, and it's usually used as kind of in a pejorative way, as it's not good to be a supersessionist, believing that basically the Jews are kind of out of the covenant now, and now Christianity and the church has replaced them in terms of God's promises to the world. All kinds of conversations around supersessionism. I'm not going to try to even dive into that now, but it's a really important part of what he's bringing to the conversation about race. That's an important through line in the book, so I want to highlight that under the main idea. But the research, I mean, this is just off the charts amazing research. It demonstrates an incredible range of not only just of what he's actually researched, but also what he is mastered in terms of literature and what he's able to give critiques towards. So, for example, he brings in the patristics. He talks about ancient theology from Gregory of Nyssa and Irenaeus, for example. He also gives you a summary of Immanuel Kant and specifically his account of race as a philosophical construct and his Kant's way of imagining it in a Christian sense. He gives you a summary of Cornel West's work and a critique of it. He gives you a summary of people like Michel Foucault and pushes back on Foucault in some key ways. There's a whole middle section of the book where he engages with modern African-American studies and theologians like James Cone and Albert Rabateau. And then he gives you a whole section of really, really insightful readings of some of the autobiography narratives in the colonial slave era of people like Frederick Douglass and Britton Hammond and Jarena Lee. It's an astounding range of work, and you read this book and you get very comprehensive summaries and engagements with all of those thinkers and more that I didn't even mention, and you get Carter's critiques of them as he's knitting together this whole account, this comprehensive account of where we find ourselves as modern people in terms of understanding ourselves as being raced, or being thought of in subcategories of races. So the research is, it's highest possible rating you could give the research behind a book like this. It's incredible. Now, the readability. This is where it's not for everyone. And this is where hopefully this review will help someone kind of think through whether or not they would want to dive into this work, because it is very dense and it's also long. So some works are dense but not necessarily long. This is dense, hard to chew through, and it's also pretty long because it's also very comprehensive, as I mentioned a few times. So, I consider myself a pretty fast, pretty quick reader, and it took me several weeks to get through, which is unusual for me. But I was really trying to internalize what Carter is saying, and it's just not a quick read. He circles back to a lot of ideas as he builds on them, kind of like Charles Taylor in that way. But it's not super readable, just to be totally upfront with you, especially if you aren't familiar with, if you haven't read a lot of philosophy, if you haven't read a lot of those thinkers I just listed off, or even some of them, then this is going to be like jumping headfirst into the deep end for you. It doesn't necessarily mean avoid it, but just know that going into it. It's a heavy lift. It's work to get through. And so, gosh, what I learned more about how modernity is a significant change historically, how people like Immanuel Kant really turned a corner in terms of imagining humanity and our capabilities as humans, and how racial categories were part of that whole project of how the Enlightenment really changed our entire imaginary of how we find ourselves in the world. Learned a lot about that. I learned a lot about how to apply ancient patristic theology, like Irenaeus, to our modern situation. And incidentally, his chapter on Irenaeus is an awesome work summary of Gnosticism. It's one of the best single chapters on understanding what Irenaeus was combating in the Gnostics of the time. And also, this is where I'll come back to supersessionism. This is probably one of my biggest takeaways, the things I'm the most thankful for from reading this book. I think I finally started to grasp the accusation of supersessionism and why that is significant and why we need to be aware of it. Because a big element of Carter's argument here is that Christians, modern Christians, particularly Western Christians, need to understand that they have been enfolded into a pre-existing covenant that was made with a pre-existing people group, namely the Jews. So if you are a Christian, you believe you have been folded into that covenant, contra someone like Kant, who had actually tried to abstract Christianity out of that being given to a specific people group and then broadened out to the world. Kant kind of abstracted it as kind of a universal, idealized religion that did not have any roots or connections to a specific people. Thereby, you can maybe start to see that loosening up of that connection opens a door for then reimagining humanity as being racialized. And what gets really, really unsettling and problematic is when the European, Western, Enlightenment-drenched imagination made that, as Carter would argue, I think, unhooked itself from the Jewish covenant and then started to subtly reimagine itself as the one who had received this idealized Christian religion that it then needed to bring out to the rest of the world in the form of colonialism. So as you start to really grapple all of these layers of this argument and the history and the philosophy there, you start to see the enormity really of the accusation of supersessionism and how that seemingly very specific idea opens up a whole kind of landscape or horizon of problems that we're wrestling with today. So man, I learned a lot about that. And of course I learned a lot about that whole laundry list of thinkers that I just gave you. I learned a ton about some of what they're bringing, particularly the middle section on African American studies. That was, for me, I've read some of James Cone, but I wouldn't consider myself super well versed in the breadth of those thinkers. And gosh, I found that so helpful, and it gave me some pointers to some thinkers I want to start to do my own work with and research more out now. So so that's Race, a Theological Account by J Kameron Carter. Man, I have very, 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 very high praise for this book. I think it's astounding, and I think I'm gonna link actually to my review of Remy Brague's The Kingdom of Man as a companion piece to this. It's a previous book I looked at, but he also brings a great philosophical history account for modernity, which is an important part of J Kameron Carter's work here. So maybe check that out and check out the books I recommended in that video if this is something that sparks your interest. But I recommend this very, very highly if you can work hard through a deeply philosophical, dense text. But I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you for my next review.